The officer pressed his hand into her shoulder and forced her down onto the cold stone in front of the courthouse steps, ordering her to stay still like a dangerous suspect caught in the act. He smirked when she calmly stated her name, her title, and asked him to activate his chest camera. But just as the handcuffs began to close around her wrists, the great bronze doors behind them swung open. Clerks, attorneys, jurors, bailiffs, and judges stepped out one by one, and not a single one of them said a word. They stood together, straight and silent, their eyes fixed on her. The smile drained from the officer's face in an instant, and for the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to be watched. If you want to see justice turn the tables on power, follow this story to the end, and watch a woman who was forced to kneel bring an entire system to its knees instead. Days before that morning on the courthouse steps, Judge Ilara Voss sat behind her bench, presiding over a hearing that would decide the fate of a contract worth more than $180 million between the city of Bellhaven and Crow Civic Systems. The company had been paid to install cameras, manage police data storage, and modernize security across the courthouse and the police department alike. An independent auditor had discovered that thousands of hours of footage were missing, that dozens of pieces of equipment had been built for but never installed, and that a set of hidden accounts had been used to quietly edit footage pulled from police body cameras. The courtroom that morning smelled faintly of old wood polish and fresh coffee, the kind of ordinary scent that made the weight of the hearing feel strangely out of place. Ilara had read every page of the audit twice the night before, highlighting inconsistencies in yellow ink until her kitchen table had disappeared beneath a drift of paper. She was not a woman who enjoyed confrontation for its own sake, but she had learned long ago that avoiding it rarely made the underlying problem disappear. Sterling Crow's legal team stood before her and requested that the entire audit be sealed, citing what they called concerns for public security. One of the attorneys, a young man with an expensive watch and a rehearsed smile, leaned in close enough to the microphone that everyone in the room could hear him remind Ilara that her upcoming reappointment might face difficulty if this case continued to move forward. Ilara did not raise her voice. She simply asked whether he wanted that comment entered into the official record. The room went silent, and the attorney sat back down without another word. She ordered the corporation to hand over all original unedited data within a short window and warned that any attempt to delete or alter records would be treated as obstruction of justice, a charge she reminded the courtroom she took seriously, regardless of who was sitting at the defense table. After the hearing ended, her chief clerk, Sienna Marlowe, discovered that someone had attempted to access Ilara's personal calendar through the Bellhaven Police Department's internal servers. Ilara assumed it might be a routine security check tied to the ongoing case, something bureaucratic and forgettable. Sienna was not so certain. She had worked in that courthouse for years and had never once seen a routine check target a sitting judge's private schedule. Across town in an office paneled with dark wood and framed commendations, Sterling Crow's people believed Ilara was simply a black woman who had been elevated to the bench to create the appearance of diversity, someone who could be pressured into silence with the right amount of leverage. They underestimated, as so many had before them, exactly how far she was willing to go to protect the integrity of her courtroom. In the office of Police Chief Harlan Quill, framed photographs of the chief shaking hands with mayors and senators lined the walls, each one a quiet reminder of the network he had spent 3 decades building. Rain tapped lightly against the tall windows of his office, and somewhere down the hall a radio murmured the morning traffic report, ordinary sounds for what was about to become a far from ordinary conversation. Quill studied Ilara's schedule on his monitor, his jaw tight, his eyes narrow with calculation. He turned to Sergeant Kane Drayton, who stood at ease near the doorway, his uniform pressed and his expression eager. Quill did not raise his voice either, though for entirely different reasons than Ilara had. He spoke the way men speak when they have never once faced consequences for the things they say in private. Monday morning, he told Drayton, give her a reason she can no longer sit in that chair. Quill never told Drayton to attack Elara outright, because men like Quill rarely put their true intentions into words that could be recorded or repeated in a courtroom. Instead, he spoke of creating a security incident serious enough that the Judicial Oversight Board would begin to question her judgment, her temperament, her fitness to remain on the bench. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Drayton would intercept her outside the courthouse, provoke a reaction, and then claim she had resisted a lawful security check. Crow Civic Systems would provide a conveniently edited clip of the encounter, one that would paint a calm and lawful woman as volatile and dangerous. In the locker room that morning, Drayton had joked with two other officers about finally getting to teach someone a lesson, though he had carefully avoided naming who that someone would be. He had spent 19 years on the force building a reputation as a man who got results, and he had learned that results rarely invited questions as long as the paperwork looked clean enough. Drayton relished the assignment more than he should have. He had spent years mocking black attorneys behind their backs, calling them beneficiaries of a system that had gone soft, men and women who he believed had been handed opportunities rather than having earned them. He genuinely believed that a woman like Elara only held power while she sat behind that bench, and that outside those walls, stripped of her robe, she was simply another face he could push around without consequence. Officer Arya Quinn, assigned to drive patrol that morning, overheard fragments of the plan but did not know who the target was. She was told to keep her dashboard camera off until Drayton gave the signal, and though something about the instruction unsettled her, she said nothing, the way she had said nothing so many times before. Meanwhile, Elara received an invitation to meet privately with Sterling Crow at an exclusive club reserved for the city's wealthiest residents. She declined without hesitation and insisted that any further communication with his company be conducted strictly through official court filings. Sterling was furious that she had denied him the chance to negotiate quietly, the way he had negotiated his way out of a dozen difficult situations before. He referred to her privately as a woman who enjoyed being difficult for attention, and he convinced himself that damaging her reputation publicly would send a clear message to every other judge in the state who might consider standing in his way. That evening, Elara found an envelope waiting outside her front door. Inside was a photograph of her walking into the courthouse days earlier, and beneath it a single typed line that read, "Not every robe protects the person wearing it." She turned the envelope over to the courthouse's Judicial Security Division immediately, her hands steady even as her stomach tightened with a feeling she refused to name. What she did not yet know was that Chief Quill controlled the very unit assigned to investigate the threat against her, and that her complaint would quietly disappear into a drawer before it ever reached anyone who might have helped. The following morning, a fabricated notice arrived on Elara's phone, informing her that the judge's private entrance was closed for repairs and that she would need to use the side gate instead. She thought little of it, tucking her audit documents into her leather bag and setting out for the courthouse in ordinary clothes, since her robe waited for her, as always, in her chambers. She had no reason yet to suspect that the message had never come from courthouse maintenance at all, but from a system quietly controlled by the very people determined to see her fail. At the side gate, Sergeant Drayton was already waiting, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding the calculation in his eyes. When Elara approached and offered her judicial identification, without protest, he barely glanced at the card before tossing it onto the hood of his patrol car with a careless flick of his wrist. He asked in a tone dripping with mock curiosity where exactly she had borrowed that badge from. When she calmly repeated that she was the chief criminal judge of Franklin County, he laughed outright, looking her up and down before saying that she did not look like any judge he had ever met. Elara replied evenly that her appearance was not a legal standard for verifying identity, and that his job required him to check the credentials in front of him rather than his own assumptions. The response irritated him more than she expected, and he demanded to search the bag slung over her shoulder. She refused, explaining that it contained documents protected under a sealed court order, and asked him to radio for Callum Hale, the courthouse's head bailiff, to confirm her identity in person. Drayton made no such call. Instead, he ordered Arya to cut communications and announced loudly, for the benefit of the small crowd gathering nearby, that the woman in front of him was obstructing a security inspection. A handful of courthouse employees noticed her through the glass doors and began moving toward the entrance, but a security alert triggered remotely by Crow Civic Systems had temporarily locked the doors from within, sealing off any quick intervention. Drayton addressed her only as "ma'am" or "that woman" or "the suspect," even after she had stated her name and title no fewer than 4 times in the span of a few minutes. Elara noticed that the indicator light on his chest camera was dark, unlit, deliberately disabled, and she began reciting his name, his badge number, and the exact time aloud, hoping the surrounding cameras mounted along the courthouse facade might catch what his would not. Drayton leaned in close enough that she could smell coffee and aftershave on his breath, his voice dropping to something meant only for her ears. "Outside that bench," he told her, "you are nobody at all." Elara held his gaze without flinching and answered that, outside his uniform, he remained just as accountable for what he was doing to her in that moment as any ordinary man would be. The words seemed to strike something in him, some raw nerve he had not expected her to touch, and his grip tightened around her wrist as he shoved her toward the stone steps and barked at her to kneel. Elara did not resist, understanding instantly that any sudden movement would be twisted into justification for whatever came next. She lowered herself slowly, keeping both hands visible for any camera that might be recording, her knees meeting the cold stone with a quiet, deliberate calm that unsettled Drayton far more than tears or shouting ever could have. The stone was colder than she expected, and a thin morning wind cut across the plaza, carrying the smell of exhaust from an idling patrol car and the distant hum of the city waking up around them, indifferent to what was happening on those steps. She kept her spine straight and her breathing even, refusing to give him the fear he seemed so hungry to see, though her heart pounded hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. He tried to provoke a reaction from her, insisting that people like her always believed themselves above the law, that even if she truly was a judge, she would not remain one much longer after today. Arya, watching from a few feet away, felt the first genuine flicker of doubt cut through her training, and she asked Drayton to verify the woman's identity properly, only to be told sharply to stay quiet and stand down. Inside the courthouse, Sienna spotted Elara through a security monitor and sprinted toward the main courtroom where another hearing had been scheduled to begin only minutes later. Callum Hale recognized Elara on the screen instantly and demanded that security override the lock, but the system rejected every access code he entered, a message flashing across the terminal explaining that the doors had been sealed under a directive from the police department itself. Callum understood immediately that whoever was behind this held considerable authority within that department, and rather than risk a confrontation that could be spun into another false narrative, he made a decision that would define the rest of that morning. He moved quickly through the halls, gathering every judge, clerk, attorney, and staff member he could find, explaining in low, urgent tones exactly what was happening outside. Some hesitated, worried that stepping outside might be interpreted as interference with an active police matter, a liability neither their careers nor their consciences could easily absorb. Callum told them they did not need to shout, did not need to intervene physically, and did not need to raise a single hand against anyone. They needed only to stand as witnesses, to be present, to make it impossible for what was happening to remain hidden. Outside, Drayton picked up Elara's identification card from the hood of his cruiser, studying her photograph and her printed title with open eyes, before setting it back down with a shrug of practiced indifference. He reached for his handcuffs, confident that the courthouse doors remained sealed and that no one inside could reach them in time to interrupt whatever narrative he intended to build. But Sienna had found the manual emergency release mechanism tucked behind a panel near the main entrance, and Callum pulled the lever with both hands, the mechanism groaning as it disengaged after years of disuse. The two heavy bronze doors swung slowly outward, catching the morning light and throwing long golden reflections across the plaza stones. For a moment, there was only the sound of the hinges groaning and the distant murmur of the crowd holding its breath, waiting to see what would come through. It was not a handful of people who emerged. Nearly everyone present inside the courthouse that morning walked out together, judges in their robes, prosecutors mid-conversation, with case files still tucked under their arms, public defenders, clerks, administrative staff, and members of a jury pool still waiting to be called for service. No one screamed, no one ran. They simply formed rows behind Elara, silent, watching, present in a way that made the morning air feel suddenly heavier than it had a moment before. The silence unsettled Drayton far more than shouting or accusations ever could have, because there was nothing in it he could twist into a justification, no anger he could point to and call resistance. Callum stepped forward and looked directly into Drayton's eyes, his voice steady and clear enough to carry across the plaza. "You are putting your hands," he said, "on the chief judge of this courthouse." Before Drayton could respond, Chief Quill arrived, stepping through the crowd with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, raising both hands and announcing that no one was permitted to film, that this was an active counterterrorism operation and nothing more. Quill had hoped his title alone would send the crowd retreating, that decades of unquestioned deference would hold here just as it always had before. Instead, Elara remained on her knees, calm and composed, and asked plainly what evidence existed to justify treating her as a threat to public safety at all. Quill offered no direct answer, choosing instead to order Drayton to remove the handcuffs and to describe the entire encounter as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a phrase that made several people in the crowd exchange uneasy glances. Elara refused to stand immediately. She insisted in front of every witness present that they confirm aloud that she had carried no weapon, had offered no resistance, and had presented valid identification the moment it was requested. Drayton said nothing until Quill gestured sharply, forcing the reluctant confirmation out of him through clenched teeth. Only then did Callum step forward and extend his hand to help her rise. The gesture itself became a quiet, unmistakable contrast to everything that had come before it. One man using power to force her down, another using respect to lift her back up. Elara turned to face the hundreds of people still standing behind her, many of whom she had ruled against at some point in her career. Verdicts that had cost them money, freedom, or peace of mind. And yet, they had come anyway, because whatever they thought of her rulings, they knew she had never once bent the law to suit convenience. She did not ask them to cheer or to defend her personally. "Please remember exactly what you witnessed here today," she said instead, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "The truth will need people willing to speak it." A courthouse administrator had captured the entire encounter on her phone, but within minutes, Crow Civic Systems attempted to remotely wipe the footage from the internal network before it could be uploaded anywhere permanent. Sienna moved quickly, copying the file onto an offline storage device seconds before the deletion command reached its target, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Quill approached Elara and suggested they retreat somewhere private to resolve the matter quietly, away from cameras and witnesses. But she declined, insisting that every word exchanged between them from that point forward be entered into the official record. To avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, Elara announced publicly that she would not personally investigate or preside over any case connected to the incident, and requested that an outside special prosecutor be appointed from beyond the county entirely. The decision caught Quill off guard because he had prepared for anger, for outrage, for a woman lashing out and giving them ammunition to paint her as vindictive and unstable. Instead, she had calmly removed any possibility of being framed as a biased judge seeking personal revenge, leaving them with nothing to work with but the truth itself. Elara spent that evening alone in her kitchen, the same table still scattered with audit papers, replaying the morning in her mind, despite every attempt to focus on something else. She did not cry, though she allowed herself briefly to sit with the exhaustion that came from holding herself together in front of hundreds of strangers. That night, a heavily edited video surfaced on local television, showing only the moment Elara appeared to refuse handing over her bag before officers moved to restrain her, the footage carefully trimmed to erase everything that came before and after. Media outlets aligned with Crow's interests spent the following days describing Elara as an arrogant judge who believed herself above routine security procedures. Drayton appeared in a brief interview describing himself as a threatened officer who had simply been doing his job, claiming that Elara had reached for something unidentified inside her bag and that he had been forced to act in self-defense. Quill announced an internal investigation, but declined to suspend Drayton, instead praising him publicly for following procedure regardless of what he called the subject's status in the community, a phrase that made even some of his own officers wince when they heard it repeated on the evening broadcast. Sterling Crow petitioned the Judicial Oversight Board to suspend Elara immediately, arguing that her continued presence on the bench had become too controversial to ignore. If she were suspended, he understood, the order compelling his company to surrender its original data would likely be delayed for months, perhaps long enough for the truth to lose its urgency entirely. Reporters surrounded Elara wherever she went, but she refused to answer their questions with anger or with the kind of sound bites that made for dramatic headlines. She released a single brief statement instead, insisting that every citizen deserved to be treated according to the same standard, regardless of who they were or what they wore when they walked outside their own front door. Some of her advisors urged her to release the full footage immediately, certain it would end the controversy overnight, but she refused, knowing the recording remained crucial evidence and that revealing it too early might allow the opposing side time to prepare false testimony of their own. Inside the courthouse, the Unity Forge that morning began to fracture under pressure. A handful of judges quietly confided that they feared budget retaliation if they were seen publicly siding with her against the police department and its powerful benefactor. Elara never pressured anyone to sign a statement of support, telling Sienna privately that courage meant nothing if it had to be coerced out of people who did not truly feel it. Around that same time, Public Defender Reese Calder arrived at Sienna's office carrying 17 prior arrest files connected to Drayton, each one showing a body camera that had mysteriously malfunctioned at precisely the moment force was used or questionable testimony was given. Most of the individuals in those files were black, poor, or otherwise unable to afford proper legal representation to challenge the department's version of events. Sienna realized with a sinking feeling that what had happened to Elara was not an isolated incident at all, but simply the first time Drayton had targeted someone with enough resources, enough witnesses, and enough standing to fight back successfully. Reese had spent 2 long nights combing through old case files under a single desk lamp, the rest of his office dark and silent around him, certain there was a pattern hiding somewhere in the paperwork if only he looked closely enough. Buried within one particularly old file, Reese discovered something that made his blood run cold. The signature authorizing the deletion of footage in that case did not belong to Drayton at all, but to Chief Quill himself, a detail that connected the corruption far higher than anyone had initially suspected. Working quietly together, Sienna, Reese, and investigative reporter Tessa Langford began cross-referencing dozens of similar cases, uncovering a pattern that Drayton's camera had in fact never truly malfunctioned. The footage was uploaded normally each time, only to be quietly rerouted into a hidden administrative folder controlled entirely by Crow Civic systems, invisible to anyone without the correct clearance. Tessa traced a series of financial transactions and discovered that one of Sterling Crow's subsidiary companies had been funneling money into a fund managed personally by Quill, one publicly described as supporting the families of officers, but privately used to cover luxury vacations, expensive vehicles, and personal loans. Quill summoned Arya for questioning and demanded she sign a written statement claiming Alara had made threatening movements during the encounter. Arya refused outright, explaining plainly that she had seen no weapon and no threat of any kind that morning, only a woman kneeling in silence while a man twice her size stood over her. Quill warned her coldly that her career could end quickly if she failed to understand which side she needed to stand on, a threat that left her hands shaking long after she had walked out of his office. At the same time, Drayton began to sense that his superiors intended to make him the sole face of blame, someone expendable enough to sacrifice, while the architects of the plan disappeared into the background unscathed. Quill quietly scrubbed his own name from internal deployment logs and began telling colleagues in carefully casual conversation that he had never personally ordered anyone to intercept Judge Voss that morning. Alara continued appearing at the courthouse throughout this period, though she did not preside over any case tied directly to her own experience, choosing instead to handle her regular docket with the same steady discipline she always had. A defendant she had sentenced years earlier stood before her one afternoon and admitted almost reluctantly that he had never agreed with her ruling in his case, but that he had always believed she listened carefully before deciding. It was a small, quiet moment, but it revealed something important about the foundation of her reputation, one built not on popularity, but on the simple fact that people trusted her to be fair even when fairness cost them personally. Tessa received an anonymous audio file not long after containing a radio transmission in Drayton's unmistakable voice, announcing that the target had arrived and that the female judge was approaching the side gate. The recording proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Drayton had known exactly who Alara was before he ever demanded to see her identification, exposing the entire encounter as premeditated rather than accidental. This had never been a case of mistaken identity or an officer acting on instinct in an unclear situation. It had been an organized ambush planned days in advance by people who believed their positions would protect them from any real consequence. Before Tessa could publish the recording, however, her office computer was breached remotely and the audio file vanished without a trace, leaving her staring at an empty folder where crucial evidence had been only minutes earlier. Tessa assumed the evidence had been lost for good until Arya quietly revealed that a backup copy still existed in the outdated memory storage of her patrol vehicle, a system old enough that it automatically recorded radio traffic locally before transmitting the data onward to Crow's servers. Arya agreed to testify formally, though only on the condition that she be enrolled in a formal whistleblower protection program, understanding fully the risk she was taking by coming forward against people who controlled both her paycheck and, in some ways, her safety. Arya barely slept the night before she agreed to testify, running through every possible outcome in her mind, weighing the career she had built against the version of herself she wanted to be able to face in the mirror each morning. She did not present herself as a hero in the days that followed. She openly admitted that she had stayed silent through similar situations before, afraid of losing her job, and that her silence had allowed harm to continue unchecked for far too long. Alara offered her no easy comfort or hollow reassurance when they spoke privately. She told Arya plainly that her past silence had carried real consequences for real people, but that speaking honestly now could still prevent the same pattern from repeating itself in the future. Special Prosecutor Gideon Croft sent in from the state capital, specifically to avoid any local conflicts of interest, opened an independent investigation and immediately ordered the seizure of Crow Civic Systems servers before any additional evidence could be quietly erased. Sterling Crow's extensive legal team fought the search warrant aggressively, insisting the company functioned only as a technical contractor and bore no responsibility for how police officers chose to use the systems it had installed. Sienna, however, discovered that the administrative account, which had remotely locked the courthouse doors during Alara's ordeal, belonged directly to Sterling himself, a detail that erased any remaining plausibility from his claims of distance and ignorance. Quill attempted to convince Drayton to accept full responsibility privately in exchange for continued legal support and protection from the department. But Drayton had begun to realize with mounting panic that he had only ever been a tool in someone else's much larger design. He reached out secretly to Gideon Croft and offered to provide testimony against Quill in exchange for leniency, though he still insisted that he had merely followed orders and harbored no personal prejudice of his own. Gideon refused to offer him full immunity, explaining firmly that following an order did not erase the choices of a grown man capable of understanding right from wrong. Drayton might hold information capable of bringing down men far more powerful than himself, but that fact alone would not excuse what his own hands had done that morning on the courthouse steps. Just before the public hearing was set to begin, Sterling Crow released a selectively edited audio clip in which Alara could be heard saying that the police department needed to be cleaned out from the top down, a statement his lawyers intended to twist into proof of deep personal bias against every officer in the city. Crow's team used the clip aggressively, arguing that Alara harbored a fundamental prejudice against law enforcement as a whole and demanding that every piece of evidence connected to her be excluded entirely from the proceedings. The full, unedited recording, however, told a very different story. Alara had never been speaking about every officer in the department at all, but specifically about falsified records and corrupt practices, and had gone on to say clearly that honest officers were themselves victims of the very system that Crow and Quill had built to protect their own interests. The manipulated clip quickly became evidence of an entirely different kind, proof of exactly how far the opposing side was willing to go to control the narrative around what had happened. The formal hearing took place inside the very same building where Alara had once been forced to her knees, and hundreds of people arrived to witness it, though Alara had insisted beforehand that the event remain orderly and free of theatrics or spectacle. Reporters lined the back rows with notepads and quiet cameras, and outside on the plaza, the same stones where she had knelt now sat empty beneath a pale morning sky, waiting as if the building itself remembered what had happened there. Quill took the witness stand and firmly denied ever ordering anyone to specifically target Judge Voss, describing Drayton instead as an officer who had simply overreacted under the pressure of an uncertain situation. Arya then presented the recovered radio transmission, and Quill's own voice filled the courtroom clearly, instructing Drayton not to let her walk into that courtroom with those files. A data forensics expert followed, confirming definitively that Drayton's body camera had functioned normally the entire time, its light manually disabled by his own hand, while the device continued recording quietly into a secondary storage buffer. The recovered audio revealed that Drayton had read Alara's name and title aloud clearly before tossing her identification onto the hood of his patrol car, and that he had told Arya directly. In a moment, he clearly believed no one would ever hear that he knew exactly who she was, and that this was precisely why they were there that morning. The courtroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence that seemed to stretch on far longer than the seconds it actually lasted. Sterling Crow maintained his composure until his own chief accountant produced an email in which he had personally approved a substantial bonus contingent on Alara being removed from the case entirely, a document that stripped away any remaining pretense of his innocence in front of everyone watching. Gideon Croft called his final witness to the stand, and the room turned as one to watch Judge Ilara Voss herself walk forward to testify. When she entered, everyone present rose to their feet together, not out of courtroom procedure this time, but because she stood before them now as a private citizen and a witness, rather than as the woman presiding from the bench above them. They stood because they had watched her endure public humiliation and had still seen her refuse to answer it with vengeance disguised as justice. Ilara recounted the events of that morning in a calm, measured voice, neither exaggerating de Drayton's actions nor concealing her own fear in the moment it had happened. She admitted openly that the most frightening part of the entire ordeal had never been the stone beneath her knees, but the realization that Drayton had known exactly who she was and still believed he held enough power to rewrite the truth however he pleased. Crow's attorney attempted to provoke her, asking pointedly whether she wanted to see every person connected to the incident utterly destroyed as a result of what had happened to her. Ilara answered without hesitation that she was not asking for anyone to be treated the way she had been treated, only that they be held accountable under the exact same laws that applied to everyone else who walked through those doors. The response quietly dismantled any remaining strategy to paint her as a vengeful woman driven by anger rather than principle, leaving the defense with nothing left to stand on. Drayton was called back to the stand and standing before the full courthouse staff. He no longer carried a trace of the arrogance he had shown that morning on the steps. He admitted that Quill had assigned him the task, but also acknowledged in a voice that finally cracked under the weight of it that he alone had chosen the manner in which he humiliated her, believing that no one would ever dare stand against the authority of his badge. He was arrested on charges including unlawful detainment, falsifying official reports, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights, charges that would follow him for the rest of his career in law enforcement. No one in the gallery cheered as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and the silence in that moment felt heavier and more fitting than any applause could have been. Quill was handcuffed almost immediately after stepping down from the witness stand, the same officers who had once answered to him now leading him quietly out a side door. Sterling Crow was indicted separately on charges of conspiracy, bribery, and destruction of evidence, his company's name suddenly appearing in headlines that had nothing to do with technology contracts or civic partnerships. Three men who had once believed Ilara held no real power beyond the walls of her own courtroom now found themselves facing the full weight of the law inside the very building where hundreds of people had once risen silently to defend her. Even with the truth fully exposed, Ilara still faced a quieter, more personal question in the days that followed, one that no verdict could answer for her. She wondered whether she could truly return to sit behind the same bench that had once made her a target for men who believed her position was nothing more than decoration. Weeks later, Drayton accepted a partial plea deal and agreed to cooperate fully with the broader investigation that had grown far beyond anyone's initial expectations. His cooperation earned him consideration for a reduced sentence, though it did nothing to erase the responsibility that remained squarely his own. Quill was formally removed from his position as chief, and Sterling Crow resigned as chief executive once his own board of directors turned against him to protect the company's remaining reputation and shareholders. The contract with Crow Civic Systems was suspended indefinitely, and every camera system installed under his company's watch was placed under independent external oversight for the first time since the original agreement had been signed. The broader investigation reopened dozens of arrests connected to Drayton over the years, finally giving people who had once been dismissed as unreliable a real opportunity to have their accounts heard and taken seriously. Arya was suspended temporarily for her earlier silence, but was ultimately permitted to keep her position after completing a lengthy professional accountability program designed to address exactly the kind of institutional fear that had kept her quiet for so long. She understood clearly that telling the truth once did not instantly erase the harm caused by every time she had chosen not to. Sienna was appointed to a newly formed Judicial Data Protection Committee, while Callum Hale began leading a new training program focused on conflict resolution between courthouse personnel and law enforcement, drawing directly from what he had witnessed and organized that morning. The Judicial Oversight Board offered Ilara an extended leave of absence, but she chose to return to work instead, not to prove that she had emerged unaffected by what had happened to her, but because she refused to let the people who had orchestrated the entire scheme decide when or how she stepped away. On the morning of her return, the courthouse hallways filled early, with staff who had come simply to see her walk through them again. She crossed the exact stretch of stone where she had once been forced to kneel, and there was no plaque, no monument, no marker of any kind, because she had never wanted the moment turned into a tribute to herself. The morning air felt lighter than it had that day, warmer somehow, though the stone beneath her shoes was every bit as cold and unremarkable as it had always been, a small reminder that dignity had never come from the ground itself, but from the people who had chosen to stand upon it beside her. When Ilara walked into her courtroom that day, everyone rose as courtroom procedure required, the same as it always had on any ordinary morning. But she noticed something different in their eyes this time, a respect that had nothing to do with the robe she wore and everything to do with the way she had chosen to wear it. She sat down, looked out across both sides of the room slowly, and spoke the same simple words she had spoken thousands of times before that day. "Please be seated," she said. "Court is now in session." The story ends there with the quiet sound of a wooden gavel meeting its base. No cheering crowd, no triumphant declaration, nothing staged for anyone watching. There is only a system that had once been twisted and manipulated behind closed doors, now forced back into motion under the plain, steady light of the truth, carried forward by a woman who never once needed to raise her voice to be heard. Long after the cameras and reporters had gone, the courthouse steps remained exactly as they always had, ordinary stone worn smooth by decades of footsteps, holding no memory of what had happened there except in the people who had chosen on one quiet morning to stand.